here's your host.
All right, guys, welcome back. I am Andy Lehman, your host, and here's what I do. I help you start and grow your podcast, answering any podcasting questions along the way. If you have questions about podcasting, I would love to answer them. Send an email to hello@podcastanswers.com with your question, and I will try to answer that directly to you or on an upcoming episode of the Podcast Answers. Last episode, we talked about recording your episode live. If you've not heard that episode yet, go back and listen to it. It was an amazing episode. I'm doing this episode live both on the new podcast apps as well as YouTube. So if you've not listened to that, go back and listen. This week, we are going to be talking about getting your podcast listed in all of the directories. And so let's go. All right. So podcast directories, what are they and why do they matter? So a podcast directory is basically a way for you to find a podcast. And that's very simply, but just think of Google, right? The internet is vast and there's so many websites out there. And we need to find a website for learning how to do mowing the yard. Let's just say you need to find an episode or a website about how to mow your yard. What do? You go out to Google and you type in how to mow your yard and websites come up, right? Same thing with podcast directories. There are so many different podcasts, but how do we know how to find them? How do we know where they're at? So that's what a directory is. And a lot of times podcast apps will pull from specific directories, and maybe Apple Podcasts or things like that, or Google Podcasts or Spotify, Amazon Music, Podcast Index, etc. But you need to not just expect that you're going to be in these directories. You have to actually put your podcast episode, your podcast into these directories. So in order to do that, though, you have to have an episode or a trailer in your RSS feed. So that's why I recommend coming up with a trailer. If you're just starting out with podcasting, go ahead and create yourself a trailer episode. And the reason you do that is because, for one, it helps people know what they're getting into when they're going to be listening to your podcast. But it also allows you to submit your show to directories, because without that, they won't index you. You have to have an episode or a trailer in order to be indexed. So submitting to your directories. Many hosts have a quick way to get listed in the directories in their interface. While this works, I like going to the directory and submitting myself, just because I like owning my own stuff. If I leave that host, my directory may be tied to the host. My directory entry may be tied to the host, and I don't want to do that. So I like to be separate. I like to take my own information, take my own podcasts, and submit them to all of the directories that I'm going to need to be involved in to get my podcast in. So Apple Podcasts is going to be the main podcast app directory that I would get in first. And the reason I say that is because Apple provides an API, which is an application programming interface, that allows other apps to search its directory. So lots of apps actually get their listing from Apple Podcasts. So you may have your favorite niche little podcast app, and it may not be Apple Podcasts, but it may be using the Apple Podcast directory in order to get its listings for the different podcasts. So how do you get listed in an Apple Podcasts? Well, you go to podcastsconnect.apple.com. So it's a plural, podcastsconnect.apple.com. You have to have an Apple ID, but you can create one there and get it verified and go ahead and use it. But if you have an Apple ID, perfect. You just sign in with that. You click the plus button. You say add a show, and it's going to say add a show with RSS or add a show without an RSS feed. Without an RSS feed, you're just going to be listed in Apple Podcasts. And so we don't want to do that. We want to create one with an RSS feed. So you're going to take your RSS feed from your podcast host, submit it to that. Now, Apple Podcast is a fairly manual process of getting submitted. I mean, as far as that goes, they do look at a lot of them. It's human reviewed, or at least it was. It may use AI now a little bit, but it is reviewed. So it's not instantaneous. So allow yourself time to get listed. So don't expect that as soon as you hit submit, people are going to be able to find you in Apple Podcasts. So if you're planning to launch on a certain day, get your trailer episode out, go ahead and get yourself listed in Apple Podcasts. And then people, when the day comes when you release your episode, will be able to find your episode. The next place that I would go is Podcast Index. And it's a fairly new index within the last several years. I think 2 or 3 years it's been around. But it essentially is another index that allows people to be in. And the reason it's important is because lots of people were using Apple Podcasts as their directory. And some people were afraid that Apple Podcasts could go away. They're being really benevolent with their podcast listing and allowing people to be in the podcast directory for free. And so some people started podcasting Podcast Index, and you can go to podcastindex.org, click add in the upper right hand corner, put your RSS feed in. That gets verified and entered. And then a lot of newer apps are starting to use the Podcast Index actually as their index to find podcasts too. So you do that, it's great. Then Spotify is the next one. The only thing that's pulling off of that is the Spotify app. So, but it is important because there's a lot of people that do listen in Spotify. So we definitely want to be able to do that. So you go to podcasters.spotify.com. You click your profile picture in the left-hand corner and then add or claim your podcast. And then Spotify is the one app that I would submit to your podcast host because of pass-through. If you can do that, I don't know earlier I said claim it on your own, but use your host if you can, because a lot of hosts have the ability to do pass-through with Spotify. So do that. And then Google Podcast is podcastsmanager.google.com. Sign in with your Google account, click add a show. So you can do that there. And then obviously in YouTube, Google is a little bit unsure of what they're doing with podcasts right now. And so they're starting to do a lot of podcasts through YouTube. So go ahead and go into YouTube. And especially if you have a video of your show, go ahead and create a playlist and call that a podcast. And then it shows up in Apple or YouTube Music as a podcast. Now, there are many other apps that you can, and many other apps and many other directories that you can add your show to. But these are my top ones. And so these are ones where you're going to be able to get a majority of your listeners from. And again, I would submit to any directories you can. Directories are free to be listed in. And so if you find any directory, go ahead and list yourself in there, because the more places you are, the more likely people are actually going to find you. And then there may be waiting times, like I said, to have your show approved. So you may want to go ahead and submit it early. So if you know that you're going to be launching on the 3rd of July, you're definitely going to want to make sure that you're in podcast directories before that time is ready to go live. So that way people can actually find you. Now, in a bonus episode for today's podcast, for our people who support us, and we thank you so much, because we were able to get a Rodecaster Pro based on the generous donations of some of our listeners. But in a bonus episode for today's podcast, I'm going to be talking about how to use some podcast directories to get your extra things like stats, how to publish bonus content in Apple Podcasts, and how to get that bonus in Apple Podcasts. Or if you have a supporter, like buy me a coffee, you can do that, which is what we actually do. So if you'd like to support our show, you can go to buymeacoffee.com/podcast answers, and that will get you to be able to support our show and give us back a little bit of value that you found in this show. Do you need help with a podcast? Do you want to start your podcast? I am here to help. I am available for one-on-one consulting. You can find that information at podcastanswers.com. podcast.answers.com/contact. If you like this show, tell all your friends about it. If you've received value from the content that I provide, please consider giving back some value by supporting us financially or buy me a coffee. You get extra things like the bonus episode, and you help keep this show going. And you can, again, get that at podcastanswers.com/coffee is a good way to get that. And until next time, stay safe, guys, and keep podcasting.